I like to say that suicide chose me, I didn't choose it. My father took his life when I was 12, and whether he meant to or not, I was then saddled with the legacy of his suicide. I wrote Why Suicide for two reasons. First, when I was 12, adults in my life didn't have any resources to look at to figure out how to deal with a 12-year-old whose father had just taken his life. That was the first reason. So I wanted people to have resources that I didn't have and that the adults in my life didn't have at the time. The second reason I wrote Why Suicide was that it gave me an excuse to research all the questions I had about my father's suicide, all of the why questions that survivors of suicide are inevitably left with when someone in their life takes their life. Why Suicide is for three groups of people. First, it's for people who've lived through the suicide of a loved one. Second, I wrote the book for people who are concerned about a loved one who might be thinking about suicide. And third, I wrote the book for people who are thinking about taking their lives. I hope that people who've lived through the suicide of a loved one will read this book and recognize in the stories of a lot of the people I've included in this book things about themselves that feel familiar, so that they don't feel alone in their experience of living through the suicide of a loved one. Second, I hope that by reading about the experiences of other people, that the people who read this book will recognize that they can not only survive the suicide of a loved one, they can go on and thrive, they can live again. And third, there are lots of resources that I include in this book, so that if you've been through the suicide of a loved one, you can find a support group, you can find a book, you can find access to therapists, any number of resources that will help you deal with the suicide of a loved one. My hope is that those people who are worried about a family member or a loved one who is suicidal will be able to recognize, after reading this book, some of the things that they need to look out for. For example, if their loved one is depressed, if their behavior has changed dramatically. It's very tough to recognize these things and to see it before the fact. But I hope by reading this book, people will be able to see those things in their loved one. Also, I include lots of resources for people who are concerned about a suicidal loved one, whether their loved one is suffering from depression or has already tried to commit suicide before. People who are thinking about taking their lives often have no idea and don't think about the impact their actions will have on those they left behind. So for someone who's thinking about suicide, toying with the idea, by reading about what those left behind have to live through, I hope that they'll look at that and think twice or three or four times before they actually take their lives. My father, in his suicide note, said that he thought all of us would be better off with him dead. And in fact, that wasn't the case. That's what he thought, but it was actually quite the opposite. I hope that people who are feeling suicidal can read this book and take inspiration from the stories of people I write about who were suicidal or attempted suicide and actually found their way back to living a good life. I hope that serves as an inspiration for them. Third, I hope that people who are feeling suicidal who read this book can find the resources they need, whether it's a therapist, a support group, a good hospital, so that they can avoid the same fate that my father found himself in. I had wanted to write a new edition of Why Suicide for a long time. At the time I first wrote the book, which was first published in 1996, I was still very angry about my father's suicide. I still was in a very blamey mode. And so reading the book years later, I was struck by how much of that had seeped into the book. And I hadn't intended to write a book that was blamey or angry, but the book had an edge that I didn't like. So for a long time, I thought about wanting to revisit the book. I had the opportunity to revisit the book in 2000, and that turned out to be around the same time that my mother started to threaten suicide. So I set the book aside then, and then in 2008 on Election Day, my sister-in-law jumped to her death. And that really propelled me to revisit the book for personal reasons. I really needed to go back and look at the book, look at the material again, and revisit it. And by rewriting the book, it really helped me deal with her suicide. I think the most important thing I learned from writing this book, from interviewing lots of people who'd lived through the suicide of a loved one, was that I wasn't alone. A lot of us who've been through the suicide of a loved one feel that we're the only ones in the world, and we're often reluctant to speak about it. But by talking to lots of people who'd been through the suicide of a loved one, I realized that my experience was fairly common, and there was comfort in that. Something I came to terms with while I was working on the book was the fact that I was never going to find satisfying answers to why my father killed himself. And almost all of us who've been through the suicide of a loved one are looking for those why answers. Why did he do it? Why didn't he leave a note? Why? Why didn't I do this or that to somehow prevent the suicide? And no matter how much you look, no matter how much information you find, there's never a satisfying answer for why. Something else I discovered while I was working on the book is that over time I found comfort just from reading, researching, talking to people. I got more and more comfortable with the subject so that I'm able to talk about it in a way now that isn't as painful as it once was. I had planned to do a very modest rewrite of Why Suicide. I figured it would take me 1 or 2 months. But what I wound up doing was throwing out half of the book. So half the book is entirely new. I rewrote the other half, and I included about a dozen new interviews in the book, almost all with people who'd lived through the suicide of a loved one. I also interviewed some people who had thought about killing themselves and some people who had tried and failed and were glad they'd failed. People often talk about trying to find closure in the aftermath of a suicide, and I hate that word. I don't think there's anything like closure to be found after a loved one has taken his life, but I think it's possible to integrate the experience, to get used to the idea of what you've been through, and to learn to live with the experience, and not to feel as ashamed about what, well, for example, what my father did.